Hello, and welcome to the Data Conversion Laboratory Learning Series. Today, we are thrilled to host a lunchtime conversation with publishing luminaries Mark Gross and Bill Kasdorf. My name is Marianne Kalahana. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before I turn it over to Mark and Bill, I do want to encourage everyone to submit any questions or comments via the Q&A box. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available in the on-demand webinar section on the DCL website. Before we begin, I would like to provide a short introduction on Data Conversion Laboratory, or DCL as we are also known. Our mission is to structure the world's content. Content can unlock new opportunities for innovation and monetization when it has a foundation of rich structure and metadata. For content to be easily discovered and used across various platforms, it should be converted into an XML format from which machines can extract pertinent information. DCL services and solutions are all about converting, structuring, and enriching content and data. We are one of the leading providers of XML conversion services, data conversion, structured product labeling conversion, and S1000D conversion. Many people are well aware of our excellent content conversion and transformation services, but we also do a lot of work in the other areas listed on this slide: entity extraction, third-party validation of previously converted content, semantic and metadata enrichment, data harvesting or web scraping, content reuse analysis, and structured content delivery to industry platforms. If you have complex content and data challenges, we can help. Now, before we begin, I would like to launch a quick poll just so we understand what your role is in the industry. So I'm going to invite you to simply answer the best you can from the options listed below. What is your role in the industry? And I'll give just a minute for that. And while you're submitting your answer, I do want to let everyone know that Bill and Mark have not scripted their chat because we really wanted to have a natural conversation about publishing not only during a pandemic, but also during a time of great change for our industry. All right, I'm going to close the poll and just share the results so everyone knows who we have with us today. So almost half of you are from the scholarly publishing industry. Looks like we have some educational publishers, legal trade publishers, and some service providers. So welcome, everyone. All right. It really feels funny for me to introduce two gentlemen that truly need no introduction. Mark Gross is president and founder of DCL. He established Data Conversion Laboratory 39 years ago and is an industry leader in structuring content and digitization practices. Bill Kasdorf is principal of Kasdorf and Associates and a founding partner with Publishing Technology Partners. He's an expert on accessibility, XML, HTML, EPUB modeling and specification, standards alignment, and workflow. Thank you both for joining me for lunch. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne. I'm really excited about this, and I'm really it's really wonderful to welcome Bill to our webinar series. And it's unscripted. All the M's and R's, of course, of that. I want to start by Bill. We actually haven't seen each other in a long time. It's just the last few days that we actually saw each other on video, which is interesting because you know, being able to be on these video conferences means you can see people you don't see otherwise except for conferences every once in a while. But tell me, Bill, tell us a little bit what you're up to these days, and you know, what's going on in your life.
Sure, thanks. Nice to be here with you, Mark. We've known each other for a long time. I can't resist mentioning that I did a book many years ago called The Columbia Guide to Digital Publishing. Guess who I got to write the chapter on data conversion? Mark Rose. So
and I think the book is still right here still.
Yeah, we go way back. So in terms of what I'm doing recently, as Marianne mentioned, you know, most of my consulting work centers on things like editorial and production workflows and content modeling, metadata, all those kinds of geeky things. I was talking to my PTP colleagues the other day, and as we got an inquiry on a publisher that wants our help, and one of my colleagues mentioned, boy, it sounds like they maybe want to get into the weeds. And I said, well, that's good. That's what I do. I do weeds, right? But the other thing I always say I do is, I always used to say, and accessibility. And I've tried to stop saying that because accessibility is really part of all of that. So any of those engagements, I always factor accessibility in. And then one other comment I might make, Mark, that I think might be relevant is that, you know, why have clients come to me? What are they looking for? Fundamentally, I think the main driver is that they realize that they're kind of stuck in an old print-centric workflow, a book-centric workflow, a journal article-centric workflow, and they realize that they really need to be thinking digital first. And that may sound obvious now, and we've been talking about this for years, but frankly, it isn't obvious because, you know, editors, production people, etc., it's really hard for them to envision their content in a different way than this kind of chapter-based or article-based format. So anyway, so that's what I do. It's very fun. I'm a busy guy.
A bunch of things there.
Yeah.
I guess one, you know, we sort of we said, you know, the 700-pound gorilla today is COVID, and that's what everybody's talking about.
Yeah. And
we agreed that that wasn't going to be the centerpiece of our conversation, but it's probably the backdrop to a bunch of things that are going on over here. So I think just in terms of publishing and the title of this webinar, Publishing at the Speed of Science, one of the things that's going on right now, and COVID has exacerbated it, is this whole idea of getting science out as soon as you know anything, preprints, even earlier than preprints, first concept thoughts, and it's become, you know, in the last few months, it's been like, how come we don't know anymore? How come? Well, I just looked at it yesterday. So how's that affecting what's going on? What are you seeing?
Well, yeah, that's, you know, you're absolutely right. That and basically, I think one thing that's notable about that is that, you know, particularly the journal publishing process hasn't suddenly changed. So, you know, preprints have been around since archive. You know, the Los Alamos was originally at Los Alamos for particle science, right? Particle scientists. So they've been depending on preprints for decades, really. But, you know, particle science, to most people, that's not the real world, right? That's not where I live. But now it's all of science is doing this, and has been for a while, but suddenly the public is paying attention to the damn preprints. And, you know, I read a comment recently, sorry about my language there, but, you know, preprints are for professionals. They're designed for your professional colleagues so they know what you're working on and they can comment on it, et cetera. And this is a very good development. But the big problem is the public doesn't understand how to interpret those preprints and doesn't realize that the results have not been vetted and verified like a peer-reviewed published article. So is making the point that, you know, the current journal publishing workflow hasn't actually changed, although it's accelerated. I've got one of my, well, actually a former client, a client that I've done some work for, not currently, is New England Journal of Medicine, and a current client is Annals of Internal Medicine. You can just imagine what those people are going through right now. They're just unbelievably, simultaneously, they've got a fire hose of content coming at them, and they've got incredible pressure to get stuff out right now. Annals, I was just blown away when I first started working with Annals. They have a database of 25,000 peer reviewers. And the process they use to vet an article is incredible. How many layers of analysis and how many steps they go through. And at the end of it, it just is a kind of provisionally accepted manuscript. And they also have a staff of statisticians, actual in-house statisticians. I think they've got 7 people that validate the statistics in every article. So, I mean, this is really, really thoroughly vetted content. How do you do that in 2 days when you've got pressure to get something up, right? It's crazy. And they've got hundreds and hundreds of things coming in every day.
Yeah, and also, I mean, a few of my clients, we've helped them identify COVID-related articles that they had in their banks. I mean, this coronavirus is not a new concept. It's been around for years. It's just this is a novel virus. So we help them identify and reset so they can go right online with them. This could never have done it 10, 15 years ago because you didn't have the right metadata on. It all depends on these new publishing techniques and being able to get ready for that. So, but how soon can an article really get out there? It used to be years. Now it's been condensed, but there's still things that need to happen. I mean, can you really speed up publishing that much?
Well, I think it actually is getting sped up. This coronavirus COVID situation has just made something that was kind of about to happen have to happen, right? And so, I read recently that I can't quote the name of the initiative, but it's a group of basically scientific experts in a variety of fields that are being assembled to be able to provide kind of, I don't want to say instant or immediate, but incredibly rapid vetting of papers for the news industry, so that the news industry can say, well, here's this preprint that came up. Instead of just jumping to some conclusion about the preprint, run it by these folks, and in a day or two they're going to get back to you about what can you say about that, or what can't you. That's a pretty cool thing. That's not still the full traditional peer review that presumably that article will still go through. It's not a substitute for it, but I think that's really interesting. One of the, you may know that I'm involved in lots of different standards organizations, and the one that most people probably on this call haven't heard of is IPTC, which is the International Press Telecommunications Council. It's all the big news agencies and news organizations around the world. And they're dealing with this problem from the other side of the screen, as you might say, that they're getting deluged with this stuff, and they've got to sort out what can they say that's responsible, and they still need to get the news out, right?
Right. And it almost sounds like what you're describing here is like taking crowdsourcing to a much more serious level. I mean, it's almost like
it's a validated crowd, right?
It's a validated crowd, but we've seen that even unvalidated crowds can get very accurate. I think it's gotten gamed a lot, but I remember when they did some analysis of what was going on in Wikipedia, they found a lot of accuracy based on just editors who are almost self-selecting. But now it's gotten a little gamed. There are organizations that are going out there and doing all kinds of stuff. But the communications capability you've got here, and in fact, you've got everybody on computers, everybody on broadband, you've got billions of people out there. It means that even if you select carefully, you still have millions of people out there. So that really could change things a lot, I would guess.
Yeah, you bet.
So,
and of course, another thing that Service is, think of all the millions of people who don't have access. You know, all the people in the digital deserts and the, you know, the global South that, you know, it's not as easy as it is for you and me.
Right. So how big is that global desert? I mean, we hear about the, you know, the people have iPhones. It's like a huge percentage of the world population. How big is that desert? Do you have any sense of that?
I think the number is in the billions. I can't quote the number. I bet you some of our attendees could probably cite chapter and verse on that. But it's having the device, it's having the broadband access that enables you to get the content. And frankly, another thing that both you and I are passionately committed to is standards. And underneath all of this is standards that actually makes it work, right? So that, you know, the example I've been giving people, also a COVID related thing, is, you know, everybody's on video conferences. This one happens to be GoToMeeting, but everybody's on Zoom, or they're on Teams, or they're on blah, blah, blah. And I was on a Teams meeting the other day with a client, and for some reason, Teams, I have Teams installed in my computer, but it didn't come up. And I could just click the button and said, well, use your browser, and worked fine. You know, why did that work fine? It's because there's a standard called WebRTC, which is Web Real-Time Communication. And it's what enables that to just work without you even being aware of it. You don't have to know which browser you're using. And, you know, people actually create these standards. Thousands of people are on working groups working on these standards. But you know who really drove the WebRTC working group and is driving that standard? Microsoft, Apple, Google, Mozilla, and Opera, the browsers. And they, you know, they're fierce competitors, right? But they recognize that it's in their interest. If this doesn't work on all of them, it's not going to work. So they kind of have to put their competitive impulses aside and sit down at the table and work together to get this to work. And that's why it works for us. Right. And we don't even have to know about it anymore, right? It just works.
Right. And I'm glad that also there are sort of standards in the human engineering part of it, because like the other day I was on 5 different technologies and 5 different meetings in the course of 6 hours. And just keeping track of, I seem to be able to figure out how to turn on my camera in each one of those, which because they're doing things in similar ways. Right. Which is a good thing because nobody has manuals anymore, so there's nothing to read. So if it doesn't work the way you think it would, you'd never get anything working.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're talking about accessibility, and you know, about a large part of the world doesn't have access, but just in terms of accessibility, we usually think of as people who have disabilities or people who are, and I know you've been actively working on that. It's been in the news lately because for people who are hard of hearing, people with masks, people wearing masks has been difficult. So that came up in the news recently, but certainly it's been a bigger issue for many years. We're both involved in that. Maybe you can just comment on what's going on.
Yeah, and of course, what I think is the best news on the accessibility front is that, you know, making content accessible to people with particular disabilities is still a challenge, and you do sometimes need to do a specific kind of remediation of an asset for a particular user. But having said that, it used to involve special technologies and special XML formats and special products, basically. And accessibility standards have really all converged around web accessibility. WCAG is the foundation for web accessibility. It's the foundation for accessibility specifications around the world. So, you know, US's Section 508 was, quote, refreshed a couple of years ago to align it with WCAG, and the EU requirements align with WCAG, et cetera. And so, you know, now to get a website accessible or an EPUB accessible, it's just getting your HTML right. And, you know, it's yes, you maybe have to add a few things like some ARIA markup, et cetera. I shouldn't be getting into the weeds. I told you I was a weeds guy, right? But
well, the weeds are important
the only
to this
missing
kind of
piece,
stuff.
oftentimes the only missing piece is image descriptions. That's still a challenge for people.
Right. I mean, there are things that you need to do.
The tools you're using and the technologies you're using and the markup you're using, you know, not only do you probably already know that, but the vendors that are creating your products know how to do those things. And that's just a huge benefit.
Right, but it's also care on the thing, on best practices. We said image descriptions need to be there because if somebody's not sighted, they won't be able to see the image. They need some description of it. But
Right.
also things that people forget about is color blindness is a much bigger problem than non-sightedness. And
Yes.
people are careless with colors of maps and lines and all kinds of things like that. And
Yeah.
so with the web, you've got images and moving images that may disturb people with certain kinds of disabilities. So there's a whole, as you know, there's a whole bunch of things going on over there. But
yeah, and in addition, I just want to interject. In addition to colorblind people, low vision people, you know, there's 10 times as many low vision people as blind people, and you know, they need to enlarge the fonts, which you can do with an EPUB, but you know, try doing that on a phone with a PDF. It's, you know, it doesn't work. And dyslexic, you know, they need to substitute the fonts to put a dyslexic font in. And you know, I know I'm sounding like an evangelist for EPUB, but that's because I am. But that's why EPUB is so much more accessible.
You just mentioned something. What is a dyslexic font? A font? You want to just talk about that?
Dyslexic people, for example, have a problem with letters that are actually the same thing but rotated, right? So a P and a Q, or and a D, a lowercase d, a lowercase p, a lowercase q. You know, it's really pretty much the same shape in most fonts. Well, a dyslexic font makes those three things distinctly different, and it makes a huge difference to a dyslexic person to be able to read that. Okay. That's not the only thing they need. They need spacing adjustments and stuff like that too. But just being able to, I got a demo of a new technology that's just coming out yesterday, and they've got a dyslexic font built right into their platform. So that's pretty cool.
That's amazing. I didn't know that, but it's amazing how something like that. I know people have been designing fonts for generations, and fonts were always done. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art has a collection of thousands of fonts, and people don't think of it as an art form. But it's also some practical implications to something as simple as a font. I mean, we look at the ones we have available on, you know, when we load up Microsoft Word, but there are many fonts that are very specialized. So that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think the point is that once things go into an XML or into something like that separates out the content from how it appears, it makes it very feasible to make things accessible where weren't before, and then it becomes the instruments that are out there and the computers that are out there, and the ability it's just a matter of enlarging and doing things like that, which you know, will make things a lot better over time as long as people apply those kind of standards.
Yeah.
Standards again. Let's talk a little about, you know, you're doing a lot of work in education and K through 8, and I mean, so, you know, and certainly the 700-pound gorilla again, the COVID has brought things up. People have to learn at home. All kinds of things like that are going on. And I think we've discussed, I mean, it's been said that COVID isn't really changing anything that wouldn't have changed otherwise, but it's expediting, it's accelerating change, which might have taken 10 or 20 years, now might be happening in a space of 6 months or a year. I mean, we've moved our office off-site in a space of 2 days, had everybody working off-site. I wouldn't have thought you could do that in 6 months or a year. So we've been doing amazing things just because we had to. But what about education? How's that? What are the changes that are going to be long-lasting?
Well, it's still hardest in elementary school. Most of my work in education is in higher ed. And there, certainly the big publishers and lots of medium-sized and even smaller publishers for years have been trying to move, again, I mentioned getting away from the print paradigm and moving to a digital paradigm. Well, you can do a lot more teaching in a platform that can be responsive to how students progress and can be interactive, et cetera, than a paper book. But, people like their paper books. And so it's been hard for publishers to get folks to get off the paper book that they don't want to keep having to make and move on to the platform. And there's two sides to the platform. There's a publisher's platform, but there's also providing the content to the learning management system that the school uses, right? So again, it's standards that make these things work, because there's a bunch of different LMSs out there. So, but you're right, it's accelerating that, because now it's like, you need to do it online. But I've got a client right now that, the reason that they're doing this is that they've been publishing. They're a credentialing organization, but it's, they have a curriculum. It's educational, and it's in fact very complex. And they publish a giant amount of content every year in these giant print books that, these people have to study in order to pass the exams to get their credentials. And what they're finding is that, because now they've also got that content online, is that people actually prefer to use the online, because it actually teaches better than the print. And so,
right. And that's been a movement in other areas that have been going on for years, and sometimes happened very quickly. I think, in the history of where we've both been working, I guess it first happened with legal books and legal publishing, where in the 90s stuff started moving off, and part of it was because exactly that, because you have all this material that needs to be updated all the time, and in particular, big law firms didn't want to spend money on all that real estate.
Well, it's also a giant amount of content, right?
It's a giant amount of content.
And you need to be able to access all of it kind of all at once. So.
Right. And now it's moved, then it moved to scholarly publishing, and medical publishing is also, because there's just huge amounts of that.
Yeah.
And it sounds like education is the next frontier over here. I was wondering why it hasn't happened faster. And is that, you made a point that publishers want to do that, but is part of it the economics of it? Is it hard to figure out how to monetize that? That seems to be an issue. When people go online, suddenly people think everything should be free. Is that something that you've been seeing?
Yeah, and actually that's an issue that's actually quite a challenge for commercial educational publishers, because there's what's called OER, open educational resources out there. So, I was talking to one of my clients just a couple of days ago, and he's at a major university, and they basically ask all faculty, when they get their curriculum together and their reading list for a course, they have to justify now if the student has to spend more than $25 to get what they're assigning, they have to justify that. Like, what? But the university is mandating that on all, and you would know the university. It's a really big one, and they're not alone in doing that. So, wow.
So what does it do to the economics of the industry, and what does the publisher, I guess, why not? Why not that $25 book? Why not those free resources?
Well, yeah, it's all free resources. You mentioned that these things come in waves, and it hits scholarly publishing first. So you'll remember when open access first came along, and people just freaked out, about open access, and justifiably so. Commercial publishers, society publishers, particularly because they were dependent on the revenue from their journals to help keep the society alive. But now it's mainstream and it's taken for granted. And I'll have to say I tend to be a positive oriented person, let me just say, but I'm not cynical. But I'm about to say something cynical, because frankly, it was when the giant publishers discovered that they could just get paid up front for doing the work, and then they made it open and free. They thought, well, okay, that works for us. Now I'm oversimplifying dramatically here, and we've still got a huge uproar with Plan S and different kinds of commercial deals that are. It's a lot of experimentation and turmoil is going on in that area. But at least the kind of expectation that this content needs to be open and free, and the funders are kind of pushing to make that happen, is completely restructuring the whole commercial realm in STM journal publishing. Certainly, it's a problem for humanities and social sciences, but education hasn't figured out how to deal with that yet. So it's a huge problem for education.
Right. I mean, I think you've got a point. It's a very important point you're making over here, that they figured out a whole new sales model, and it's actually might be better than the other one. Getting paid up front is not a bad thing.
Right.
But even though you're not getting that long-term income on an ongoing basis, but those materials are not the kind of materials that would have long-term necessarily. I mean, there's a long tail on that. I would guess.
And that mostly works in the sciences because they have the funding to pay those article processing charges up front. But it's a huge problem for humanities scholars, for example, that they spend 10 years working on a book, and they're not going to make any money on the book, and they're supposed to pay thousands of dollars to get that book published just so that it can be open access. So how that gets funded is still being worked out, right? That's not that it's not going to happen. It'll happen, but that problem hasn't been solved yet.
Right. I mean, the same issue came up with libraries and ebooks at libraries, and how do publishers monetize that. And so the model now sounds a little kludgy to me, but apparently they get a certain the publishers license an ebook for a certain number of uses, which is modeled on how many times they think a print book would be used. So I think if a print book is good for 20 readings, then the ebook is sold for 20 loans, which sounds a little kludgy, but it's really, I think that's got to be a temporary kind of thing. Somebody's got to.
Yeah, that's a case where the print model is still driving that, because the print model is for a bestseller. A given library, depending on how big the library is, might buy 10 copies of that book, or they might buy 50 copies of that book, right? Because they can only give it to one person at a time. But you brought up earlier, the kind of impact this whole COVID year is having on everything. Here we go again, right? Is that there were major trade publishers that had policies that the librarians were just flipping out about because they were so restrictive, and suddenly kind of the publishers were looking really bad by saying no, you can't have access to this content. So a lot of publishers kind of eased up on those kind of draconian requirements to the library's delight. But on the other hand, there's a financial impact on the publisher.
Right. I mean, and books weren't being loaned out. The only books that were being loaned out of libraries were ebooks for the last 4 months, right? So
that's right.
That's right. I mean, the same kind of things are going on with movies. No movies at movie theaters. So suddenly everything's being downloaded to streaming services, where before you wouldn't do that for 2 months or whatever till things became available.
Yeah, I see Marianne. I wonder if she's got a question for us.
I have a number of questions for both of you.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you want us to just slow down and shut up for a while?
No, I'm just going to interject for a moment here.
Sure.
But with the impact of the pandemic on events, many publishers, including those outside of scholarly publishing, are turning back to their publications to try to find revenue. So how could using XML help publishers to create new products and try to find new revenue streams? Wondering if you could speak to that for a moment.
You want to take that, Mark, or you want me to go ahead first?
Yeah, you're our guest. You start.
Yeah, well, another major trend, I mentioned thinking digital first instead of thinking print first in terms of how you create your content, how you manage your content, how you deliver your content. But another aspect of that is people are consuming content in more granular bits, right? They aren't necessarily getting the large publication chunks that they used to. So, if you've got XML, and particularly if you've got some semantics associated with that XML, so that you know what in all this XML that I've got here is about X, you can go into that repository of content, let me just characterize it that way, and say, you know what, I've got all these, let me just give you a mundane example, is I publish a whole bunch of cookbooks, right? So I've got Italian cookbooks, and I got French cookbooks, and I got Mexican cookbooks, etc. And it's like, well, you know what, I can put together a bread cookbook, because everybody's baking bread all of a sudden, right? So I could look at all that XML I got and say, give me all the recipes that are about bread, and now I got a new book to sell, right? So that's just one example.
Right, and I think, well, first of all, that the recipe example reminds me, you could do more than that. I had a client who took all these, they took all their cookbooks, turned them into XML, and were able to sell a version of it that would go to a Nestle, a chocolate cookbook that would go to Nestle and have all Nestle products in there. Same thing could go to a competitor that had their products, and they could do all those kind of things with them.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, I think you make a very good point. I mean, as the market widens, there's that long tail there of people who would never have looked at certain books because it wasn't available, they didn't know where to find them, and now they could find more. A very esoteric book might now have a much larger audience than it ever had before, but it has to be delivered in different ways. It has to be delivered so that somebody can instantly get it on their phone, and the only way you can do that is if it's an XML, so that it can be reformatted, reorganized, and taken in little bits as you go along. And going back to what's been going on the last 4 months, I mean, those publishers who have been very digital, I think, have been able to take advantage of that even now and be able to distribute information that if they weren't ready for that, we've never been able to do. It's just that it wasn't time to set it up. So, those who thought ahead, I think, are doing well with that. I don't know if well is the right word. It's still difficult times for many, but certainly.
Yeah, they're in a transition. Transitions are always hard, but you can come out better on the other end. One of the ironic things is that books don't need to go out of print because they don't use print.
Right, ever.
Yeah.
Right. They're never out of print anymore.
Right.
We've got an inventory of millions of books. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, Mark, I have a couple of questions for you. So it was asked, has DCL been busier since the pandemic? And tacked on to that, what services are DCL delivering due to COVID-19 that they did not see before and were not needed before? And of course, I think back to the second, third week of March, that weekend, and maybe you could share some of that story.
Right. So I think we're very lucky to be in an industry that's all digital. And many have not been that lucky. We've been able to pretty much keep our regular business going. And many of our customers are all digital. I mean, they're getting content and data from all kinds of places. And that's continued. And even, I was worried about like the conferences business. And I actually were going to talk about, I was going to ask you about that, where that's going. But conference proceedings seem to have still been going on. People have made material available. So even though the conferences haven't physically taken place, still the proceedings have really been done and distributed. And so those, I think, have been going on in general. I mean, specifically with COVID, I mean, I mentioned two of our clients have asked us to go and take all their COVID-related papers so they can issue them right away. And some of those were done over a weekend. I mean, it became like, okay, we got to get it all out by Monday. And because they were digital and they were able to gather, they were able to find them, we were able to publish things very, very, very quickly. So this didn't happen by accident. I mean, in terms of DCLs, I mean, I think we've been, and I didn't know we were preparing for this, but for the last 2-3 years, we've been really upgrading phone lines and upgrading equipment so that you can actually start working off it. We never knew what that would be for. Never in my wildest dreams that anybody think of this. I think this is truly a black swan, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so, very good point. You know, you're mentioning the conference business, and there's an interesting parallel to what we were talking about with education. And this is actually a point you made to me in a conversation, so I shouldn't be taking words out of your mouth. But, you know, it's that is being physically present the best way to consume a presentation or not? And it's like, you know, I think I'm a firm believer that the conference business will come back, but in a different way, because I think that, you know, the networking, the hallway conversations, you know, the ability to meet new people. It's not just seeing old friends; it's meeting new people. It's, you know, people often say that I seem to know a lot about stuff, right? How did I learn all that stuff? It was going to conferences all these years, right? I just paid attention to what people were doing. But you don't actually have to be physically present to consume the presentation. You have to be physically present to interact with that person, right? And right. The same thing's happening in education. I'll let you take that, because that's actually a point you made to me the other day.
Yeah, the point I was making is that maybe education is being done all backwards. and actually some elementary schools have gone to a model where the class presentation by the teacher is done over video and done in the evening while the homework is being done in the classroom, which is totally backwards to what we've been thinking about. But this way the classroom is done under supervision so that the child can get instruction where he's having problems, and he can be listening to a presentation can be done on video. Right. So I think that really turns things on its head, but it sounds like a great model. It seems to be working well, and the same thing might be happening in conferences. I think, Bill, you made the point that there are conferences where the materials are sent in advance, and the conferences, the intention is to be networking and talking to those people.
That's right. So that's what the W3C did. They have a semi-annual confab that gets lots of people together, and they basically just recorded all the presentations that would have been made at that conference and said, here, watch these in advance, and then we're going to have two-hour conversations as web call-ins, and no agenda, all Q&A. And it was fantastic. I think, you know, certainly the largest Zoom call I've been on, I think they had 400 and some people on a Zoom call. It was amazing, but it really worked.
How do you coordinate 400 people on asking questions? It's like, I don't know how you do that.
You know, this is the W3C, and that group also uses what's called IRC, which is internet chat, for almost all of its meetings. So basically, you just basically, in effect, put your hand up in the internet chat, and you get in a queue, and then they are watching that and they answer the questions. Or with Zoom, you can raise your hand.
Right.
Or you have someone who pokes in with a question, like I'm going to now. Just to shift a little bit, could you speak a little bit about multi-channel dissemination, in particular workflows that are digital first and print second? Share some knowledge on that.
Yeah, exactly. And frankly, that's probably why people are feeling the pressure to make this kind of paradigm change in their workflows to be digital centric, because they realize, well, you know what, it wasn't long ago that the EPUBs came out weeks and weeks after the book was after a book was published. And now the expectation is, well, you should have it at the same time. And by the way, that EPUB ought to be accessible. There shouldn't be an accessible version that has to be made later. It's like, no, it should be accessible in the first place. But in terms of workflows, the tools are basically there already, right? I mean, we have the models, we have the standards. They're always in evolution. So I wouldn't want to give anybody the impression that job is done, right? But it's become mainstream to work in a digital way, as Mark was saying, and because of that, if you get the right kind of modeling in your content, so you're not thinking of chapters, you're thinking of topics, and you can. I think, Marianne, you were asking, when you're talking about multi-channel, you're asking for a given publication, not creating variant publications, but the same publication being published in a variety of ways. The fact that so many of the standards are really XML and HTML based really helps. So yeah, in scholarly publishing, it's JATS and BITS XML completely. It's the those are the lingua franca of scholarly publishing. But I was just working with a client, current client that I have, where I basically pointed out to them that everything in their JATS XML, this is a major medical journal, everything in the JATS XML model, the tag library, provides the ability to tag everything you need for accessibility. And then they need a specification. A big believer in a model is not a spec, right? In other words, you still need a specification for how are you going to use JATS XML. But if you do that right, then you've got everything you need in the JATS XML to just transform it to the HTML that you need for your website or that you need for your ebooks, your EPUBs.
So it's all available in JATS, but you have to have the policies and procedures and whatever in place that you're putting all the things in and not taking shortcuts around that. And
yeah, exactly. I get so many, so many people still say, well, wait a minute, I'm using JATS. Why is my JATS XML for Adapon not the same as my JATS XML for Silverchair? It's like, well, those are specifications, right? They don't ask for it to be done in exactly the same way. So you still have to work with who's the recipient of this XML and what do they need you to do so that their systems work properly with it.
Right. Right. And don't forget, I mean, we're talking about JATS for scholarly publishing, but there's other forms of XML that are used in other specific purposes for various reasons. So like a DITA is used not for scholarly publishing, but it's used in technical publications when you want to be able to modularize things. So when I first saw XML, well, actually when I first saw SGML, I said, wow, this is a language for really describing what text looks like, and that's what XML is. But you can define the purposes for it depending on what you need it for. So there are many forms that are being used out there. The nice thing about standards is there are so many of them, right?
Right.
but in any event, it allows you to be able to communicate between the various people that are out there to make sure you're doing things in the same way and that it works the same way.
Yeah, and that it's optimized for a particular purpose. So, JATS and its counterpart BITS have for years and years been optimized to represent scholarly content. And there is no better way to represent scholarly content than JATS and BITS. But guess what? When you're looking at a website, you're not looking at JATS and BITS. You're either looking at PDF or you're looking at HTML. But there was always JATS and BITS. I'll give you an accessibility anecdote. I was in a working group. Goes back a few years with some, many of these working groups are just really, really technical people. And this guy was, just a total expert tech geek, right? And he said, he just kind of posted to the list, why do we need to be paying attention to MathML? Nobody uses MathML. And I went, wait a minute. You know, he's thinking of EPUBs in trade publishing, and they never see MathML. And even when there are equations, the MathML isn't in the EPUB because it doesn't work right. So the image of the equation is in there. And he's saying, why do we even need to pay attention to this? I said, you have no idea that millions of equations are being created in MathML all the time. And any math equation that you see in a scholarly journal or a scholarly book, I can almost guarantee you was MathML at some point in the workflow, right?
Right. Or and I think that goes through for any specialized kind of area. I mean,
Right.
you know, I don't know what happens in like music publishing, but it's probably some version of that that you'd use in music publishing and in voice.
There are music markup languages. That's true.
All
Yeah.
right. So, you know, so if you've never looked at music, you'd say, why would anybody ever need that? But I think that goes through in any specialized field. And I think, you know, the beauty of XML has been is it allows that ability to be able to apply to specialized additions that you need in order to be able to work in many different areas.
Yeah. And it's really in layers, right? So you've got that underlying layer of the XML. You know, a lot of people are shocked when I remind them that we are still using XML 1.0. That is the governing XML spec right now, is XML 1.0, right? So it's just radically useful, right? But then it gets specified for DITA for topic-based authoring and JATS for scholarly journals, et cetera, but then there's a layer on top of that that says, well, this is JATS that is going to Highwire, or JATS that's going to Silverchair, or JATS that's going to Edupon. But then you've also got the publisher is saying, but here's what I need to do with this content, right? So they've got their own specification on top of that. But so it's, you know, it's like layers, but it's not, you throw this one out and do this one instead. They build on each other. That's
right. And it's moved a lot over the years. It's really been pretty interesting. So,
yeah.
Marianne, any other questions you've got over there?
Yeah, because we only got 5 minutes left before we have to wrap up.
Well, I will share one thing. You do have someone who disagrees with you about the use of MathML, in that IEEE processes and displays millions of equations without any MathML.
Right.
We can change that for you if you want IEEE, but
right.
I do understand.
Actually, that's a well-reasoned.
I have several very good friends at IEEE, so I'm going to dig into that, because I would be surprised if the equations aren't MathML upstream in the workflow. I used to be working with, I shouldn't mention this because it's a competitor of DCL, but I was with the conversion and prepress house for many years. And every equation done by that firm is done in MathML. The publisher isn't asking for it, and the publisher usually wasn't getting the MathML, but the vendor was using MathML to create the equations in the first place. So
I'm not sure that, but no, I think there are groups that are using tech. LaTeX has really been the.
That's right. Oh yeah, and particularly IEEE, I bet you, particularly because in engineering, tech and LaTeX is dominant. So yeah, that's right.
Right, and there's good reasons. But I mean,
so
it's a lot more precision that's available there than MathML when you're really doing very fine print. So it's really been a yin-yang kind of thing over the years.
Yeah.
And when you get specialized over there, that's one thing that happens over there. But and it's probably true in other places also. But the general trend in places has been to try to use XML because it's a language that lets you define lots of things. I mean, there's also other areas. CAM also is an area that you may not be able to do everything that's there. But nevertheless, I think there's large groups, and certainly there's large groups that use MathML until they get to those really, page-long equations, which may be difficult to do.
Yeah,
and that's exactly his point.
Yeah, and I take that correction. So thanks to the IEEE people that said that. But you're right. What I should say is that the math is MathML or tech/LaTeX. Very likely it's one or the other of those formats. But I can't resist pointing out that for accessibility, you want MathML. So even if you're creating your content in LaTeX, so Word, for example, you can put tech equations in a Word document or MathML equations in a Word document, but when that document gets made accessible, you actually need to convert that tech into MathML to produce the accessible content.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So if people who doesn't have MathML, they probably are going to get MathML pretty soon because they're going to be under pressure for those equations to be accessible.
Right. I think this development needs to be done. I think just the visualization of MathML, it's taken a long time to catch up when you get to really fine work.
Actually, there's some very significant work being done on MathML right now to make it easier to use and to make it easier to kind of embed in workflow. It's a MathML refresh that's being done.
Right.
And it's coming out with kind of a simplified subset that's what's mostly needed. And then, kind of the more extensive version that can basically express anything you want to express in math. But
right. Yeah.
so these standards do evolve.
The person at DCL is qualified to discuss, so it takes me out of my my area of expertise.
But that's very active.
Well, we are
ongoing work.
We are coming to the top of the hour, and I think people are finishing up their lunch. I wanted to thank you both. But one of our participants, I thought, wrote a more elegant and lovely thank to both of you, and that is thanks to the work that Bill and Mark have done in the industry, we would never have been able to produce articles in 24 hours. That is now a requirement for COVID-19 articles and content. So kudos to both of you for your work on XML and conversion workflow. And I think that's a lovely way to end. And I want to thank everyone who's taken time out of their day to join us for this webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that the DCL Learning Series comprises webinars, a monthly newsletter, and blog articles. So we hope that you take advantage of this. You can access all this information from our website at dataconversionlaboratory.com. This now concludes today's webinar. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Good to see you, Bill. See you, Marianne. Okay. Bye-bye.